So we're in Isaiah chapter 19, and last week we talked about Ethiopia, and today we're going to talk about Egypt. So chapters 19 and chapter 20 will kind of go hand in hand with one another. Chapter 20 is going to pick up yet again with the message to Egypt, and it's going to also circle back and touch on the message to Ethiopia that we studied last week. So here we are yet again. We've been talking about these alliances that Judah keeps getting involved in. And yet again, Isaiah is just pleading with the people to stop doing these alliances. Stop being scared. Stop having all this fear and running to man to save you when you should be relying upon God and the plan that He has in store for the nation. So here we have Egypt now on the scene as far as Judah being tempted to have that alliance with Egypt. And my question to you guys is, so here's Isaiah pleading to Judah about staying away from these alliances. So do you guys feel that Judah listened? Or do you feel that they went ahead and made the alliance with Egypt? Okay. And we have documentation of that in the book of Isaiah. So if we go all the way to Isaiah chapter 30, we can see one instance here. In Isaiah chapter 30, starting in verse 1, it says, "Woe to the rebellious children, saith the Lord, that take counsel, but not of me, and that cover with a covering, but not of my spirit, that they may add sin to sin, that walk to go down into Egypt, and take not," oh, wow, I'm struggling here, "and have not asked at my mouth to strengthen themselves in the strength of Pharaoh, and to trust in the shadow of Egypt. Therefore shall the strength of Pharaoh be your shame, and the trust in the shadow of Egypt your confusion. For the princes were of Zoan, and his ambassadors came to Hanes, and they were all ashamed of the people that could not profit them, nor be in help nor profit, but a shame and also a reproach." So we have documentation here that they did not listen to Isaiah here in chapter 19, and they indeed went ahead and took their counsel from Egypt. And matter of fact, in the very next chapter, chapter 31, we also see, starting in verse 1, "Woe to them that go down to Egypt for help, and stay on horses, and trust in chariots, because they are many, and in horsemen, because they are very strong. But they look not unto the Holy One of Israel, neither seek the Lord. Yet He also is wise, and will bring evil, and will not call back His words, but will arise against the house of the evildoers, and against the help of them that work iniquity. Now the Egyptians are men, and not God. Their horses flesh, and not spirit. When the Lord shall stretch out His hand, both he that helpeth shall fall, and he that is happened shall fall down, and they shall fail together." So we got the message to Egypt in chapter 19, and then we learn later on in chapters 30 and 31 that they did not heed to the warning, and they went ahead anyway and formed their alliance with Egypt, even though Isaiah was warning them not to do that. So one of the lessons that we could be learning here from these past chapters, and the one we're getting ready to read, is putting all your trust in these nations and in men are not going to get you anywhere. That is why the message that's really being pushed here is for them to put their trust in God and to have faith in God that God's going to take care of them. And the people really struggled with that. So this morning, we can look at the scriptures here. And we're going to probably go through the first 15 verses. And then we're going to touch on a bit of, geography a little later on. But God's judgment against Egypt. So in the first 4 verses here, we have an internal strife. So in verse 1, it says, "The burden of Egypt. Behold, the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud, and shall come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. And I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, and they shall fight everyone against his brother, everyone against his neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. And the spirit of Egypt shall fail in the midst thereof, and I will destroy the counsel thereof. They shall seek to the idols, to the charmers, to them that have familiar spirits, and to the wizards. And the Egyptians will I give over to the land of a cruel Lord, and a fierce king shall rule over them, saith the Lord of hosts." So one of the things I want to look at here in this very first verse, so we're talking about God's judgment against Egypt. And you would have to think back probably a year or so ago, we went through a study on judgments and judgment language. And here in Isaiah 19:1, the burden of Egypt, behold, the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud. So does anyone remember in the New Testament of some language that's being used that has really got a certain group of people confused when it comes to the second coming of Christ? Does anyone remember that? All right. So let's look at Matthew 24. And I believe it's verse 30. So Matthew 24, if we remember the AD 70 doctrine, they tried to hold to the language being used as a proof of the second coming has already happened. So what we did is we did a big study, and we looked at the language being used, and we looked at all the past judgments that were done on nations. And matter of fact, I believe we even looked at Isaiah 19 at one point to see that that same judgment language, the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud, it was being used here against Egypt, just like in Matthew 24 and verse 30. Similar language is being used for when the Romans came in and destroyed the city of Jerusalem. So Matthew 24:30 says, "And then shall appear," Jesus says, "then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." And we really studied that to try to understand what that means. Does that mean that Christ's second coming happened here on this judgment that was taking place by the Romans? Or does that mean that we're still waiting on Christ's second coming? And we really got bogged down into that. And basically we came to the conclusion that a similarity of the phrase, let's see here. No, I was thinking of something else, sorry. But we came to the conclusion that throughout history, this phrase was actually used when judgments were being discussed against the different nations. So the Lord rideth upon a cloud is a judgment type language, just like it was used here in Matthew 24. And does anyone recall of maybe some other instances to where we can further our point of this type of a judgment language that was used maybe for some other nations or different instances?
Isaiah 13.
Okay. So basically, to understand the point that I'm getting at is, so if we were to take Matthew 24:30, and we were to say, well, it says here he's coming upon the clouds, well, then we have to ask the question of, well, what did it mean back in Isaiah 19 when the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud? And what did it mean back in Isaiah chapter 13, which we'll turn there real quick. So what was it, Isaiah chapter 13? What are we looking at here? So we're talking about the burden of Babylon in verse 1. Okay, so tied in with all of that, back when we did that study, we also had to look at the phrases of Day of the Lord to see what that means. So, yeah, I mean, that goes hand in hand with the Lord rideth upon the swift clouds, because that goes in with that judgment language yet again. So in Isaiah 13, the burden of Babylon, we see that, behold, the day of the Lord cometh, in verse 9, cruel both with wrath, fierce anger, lay the land desolate, and he shall destroy the sinners thereof out of it. So what we have here is judgment language, day of the Lord. The Lord rideth upon a swift cloud, meaning there was going to be a judgment placed on this nation. And when you read the context of these events, we're not talking about the end of the world. We're not talking about the second coming of Christ. We're not talking about the great judgment day that's going to take place in our future. We're talking about judgments on these nations that are being discussed at this time.
Ezekiel 30 shows, is it the fulfillment of this prophecy or more clarification about Isaiah 19?
Let's see here, Ezekiel 30. Yeah, I think this is more clarification. Of what was going to happen, of what's happened. Yeah, so that entire chapter, well, almost that entire chapter goes along with that, in which we can read, if we want to see what Ezekiel writes about this. Okay, yeah, in verse 3, it talks about the day is near, even the day of the Lord is near. A cloudy day, it shall be the time of the heathen. So we're talking about the day of the Lord. Would someone want to read the first 9 verses?
The word of the Lord came again unto me, saying, Son of man, prophesy and say, Thus saith the Lord God, How ye will work the day. For the day is near, even the day of the Lord is near. A cloudy day, it shall be the time of the heathen. And the sword shall come upon Egypt, and great pain shall be in Ethiopia. And the slain shall fall in Egypt, and they shall take away her multitude, and her foundation shall be broken down. Ethiopia and Libya, and all the evil people, and Chub, and the men of the land that is in league shall fall with them by the sword. Thus saith the Lord, they also that uphold Egypt shall fall, and the pride of her power shall come down from the tower of Zion, shall they fall in it by the sword, saith the Lord God. And they shall be desolate in the midst of the countries that are desolate, and the cities shall be in the midst of the cities that are wasted. And they shall know that I am the Lord when I have set a fire in Egypt, and when all the helpers shall be destroyed. In that day shall messengers go forth from me in ships to make the careless Ethiopians afraid, and great pain shall come upon them as in the day of Egypt, for lo, it cometh.
All right, and then the chapter also goes on into more descriptions here about Egypt and their destruction. But staying back on the Lord is riding on a swift cloud, I have a note here of Psalm. Let's see, in Psalm 104. In Psalm 104, in verse 3, okay, yeah, so it says, who layeth the beams of his chambers in the waters, who maketh the clouds his chariot, who walketh upon the wings of the wind. So we have yet again some language concerning God and his judgments that he would make. And I guess it's a similar phrase of the clouds were going to be his chariot. And then we're reading here in Isaiah about how the Lord is riding on a swift cloud. So I think that's an interesting connection to make from the psalmist to what we're reading about that Isaiah wrote. So moving on, so I don't get too bogged down in just the first verse here. In verse 2 it says, I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, and they shall fight everyone against his brother, everyone against his neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. And then going back up to verse 1, I'm sorry, I said I'm going to move on, but so the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence. So yet again, Isaiah is getting the point across that all these fancy images, all these handmade things that the Egyptians built and they put up and they look like they've got this awe factor of, man, look how nice that is, look how sophisticated they must be. Basically, Isaiah is telling them all of that. The idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence. In other words, all these images and all these idols, they are nothing. None of that stuff is going to stand against the Lord who rideth upon the swift cloud to make judgment on Egypt. None of that stuff. And Isaiah is pretty much saying, what are you guys thinking? You're going to really try to form an alliance with Egypt? Of all the things that Egypt does, and you're going to want to form an alliance with them? Come on. And Isaiah is pleading with the people, and he's saying that God's going to set the Egyptians against the Egyptians. I mean, they're going to be fighting amongst each other. City against city, kingdom against kingdom. And in verse 3 it says, the spirit of Egypt shall fail in the midst thereof, and I will destroy the counsel thereof. They shall seek to the idols and to the charmers, and to them that have familiar spirits, and to the wizards. You know, that makes me think of an event that took place back in 1 Samuel. Does anyone recall an event to where an individual, you know, maybe he was a little nervous and fearful, and he started seeking some guidance from some of these individuals that are mentioned here in verse 3? So, in 1 Samuel, and the reason I bring this up is because this just furthers the point that God frowns on these types of things that men are trying to put their confidence and faith in. Isaiah is saying, this stuff is nothing. The wisdom of man is nothing. Why are you doing this, Judah? So, in 1 Samuel chapter 28, would someone want to read verses, starting at verse 4, and maybe go through verse 20? Okay.
And the Philistines gathered themselves together and came and pitched in Shew. And Saul gathered all Israel together, and they pitched in Gilboa. And when Saul saw the host of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart greatly trembled. And when Saul inquired of the Lord answered him not, neither by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by prophets. Then said Saul to his servants, seek me a woman that hath a familiar spirit, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said to him, behold, there is a woman that hath a familiar spirit at Endor. And Saul disguised himself and put on other raiment. And he went, and 2 men with him, and they came to the Lord by night. And he said, I pray thee, divine unto me by my familiar spirit, and bring me him up, whom I shall name unto thee. And the woman said unto him, behold, thou knowest what Saul hath done, how he hath cut off those that have familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land. Wherefore then layest thou a snare for my life, to cause me to die? And Saul swore to her by the Lord, saying, as the Lord liveth, there shall no punishment happen to thee for this thing. Then said the woman, whom shall I bring up unto thee? And he said, bring me up Samuel. And when the woman saw Samuel, she cried with a loud voice, and the woman spake to Saul, saying, why hast thou deceived me, for thou art Saul? And the king said unto her, be not afraid, for what sawest thou? And the woman said to Saul, I saw gods ascending out of the earth. And he said unto her, what form is he of? And he said, an old man cometh up, and he is covered with a mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed himself. And Samuel said to Saul, why hast thou disquieted me to bring me up? And Saul answered, I am sore distressed, for the Philistines make war against me, and God is departed from me, and answereth me no more, neither by prophets nor by dreams. Therefore I called thee, that thou mayest make known unto me what I shall do. Then said Samuel, wherefore then dost thou ask of me, seeing the Lord is departed from thee, and is become thine enemy? And the Lord hath done to him as he spake by me. For the Lord hath rent the kingdom out of thine hand, and given it to thy neighbor, even to David. Because thou obeyest not the voice of the Lord, nor executest his fierce wrath upon Amalek, therefore hath the Lord done this thing unto thee this day. Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with thee into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow shalt thou and thy sons be with me. The Lord also shall deliver the host of Israel into the hand of the Philistines. Then Saul fell straightway all alone on the earth, and was sore afraid, because of the words of Samuel, and there was no strength in him, for he had eaten no bread all day nor all the night.
So we can see here, back in verse 7, that Saul, then said Saul unto his servant, seek me a woman that hath familiar spirits. And so Saul was afraid, he was scared, and he started trying to take things into his own hands by seeking those that have familiar spirits. And this was an event that was recorded. The people would have known about. They would have known that God frowned on Saul's actions. And yet here they are, at this point in time, they're entertaining, alliancing themselves with this nation that's known for their idols and their charmers and their wizards and them that have familiar spirits. And they know this, and they know the type of people that the Egyptians are, but yet they're still tempted to go in and have an alliance with them because they're scared and their faith isn't strong enough to put it in God. So Isaiah is just like, like I said before, what are you guys thinking? Why would you do this? Do not do this. You're going to make God very unhappy with you. And it says in verse 4, and the Egyptians will I give over into the hand of a cruel Lord, and a fierce king shall rule over them, saith the Lord of hosts. So, them will I give into the hand of a cruel Lord, a fierce king. So all of what's taking place here, and the reason that they're scared to begin with is because of Assyria, who's coming from the north, and they're making their way down. And Assyria made their way into Egypt and down into Ethiopia. And basically the fierce kings and the cruel lords, when you look back in history around this time period, you had in 711 BC, you had Sargon II, an Assyrian king, and you had in 701 BC Sennacherib, an Assyrian king, who would have been the ones in command that would have came down and started taking over the land in Egypt and then in Ethiopia. So the fierce, cruel lords and the kings, we're talking about the Assyrians coming down and taking over their land. So that brings us to verses 5 through 10 now. And in verse 5, and in these verses we're describing basically the economic collapse of the Egyptians. So in verse 5, it says, and the waters shall fail from the sea, and the rivers shall be wasted and dried up. And they shall turn the rivers far away, and the brooks of defense shall be emptied and dried up, and the reeds and the flags shall wither. Let's see, so we're talking about these waters here. The waters shall fail from the sea, the rivers shall be wasted and dried up. So when you think about Egypt, and you think about what the majority of Egypt and the landscape is made up of, and you look at the map, the majority of the landscape is going to be made up of sand and rock. So water is a very precious thing for Egypt. And here the threat of the water shall fail from the sea, and the river shall be wasted and dried up. The brooks of defense shall be emptied and dried up. This is a major threat for these people. And I've got a note here that when you look at the rainfall of this area in Cairo, which is in this general area, they receive only about 2 inches of rain annually. So they're not depending on the rain for their water. They're depending on these rivers, in which we'll look at a map here in a little bit about the delta and what that's made up of. But they're dependent on these rivers. So when they hear that the river shall be wasted and dried up, and the brooks of the fence shall be emptied and dried up, that's their source of water. Without that, they have nothing. Like I said, it does not rain very often in this area. And it goes on to say, the paper reeds by the brooks, by the mouth of the brooks, and everything sown by the brooks, it says it's going to wither, it's going to be driven away, it's going to be no more. People of Egypt, you're not going to have any of this. The fishers also shall mourn. They shall cast angle into the brooks, and into the brooks shall lament. They shall spread nets upon the waters, shall languish. They that spread nets upon the water shall languish. In other words, they're not going to be successful. They're going to throw their nets. They're not going to be getting anything. And it says in verse 9, moreover, they that work in fine flax, they that weave networks, they're putting the nets together, they're going to be confounded. They're going to be confused. They're not going to know what they're doing. Their efforts are for nothing. The rivers are dried up. The people putting all this stuff together, they're going to be confounded. And it says in verse 10, and they shall be broken in the purposes thereof, all that make sluices and ponds for fish. All their efforts to try to survive the dried up rivers will be for nothing. They're not going to be able to do it. So this is a major hit to Egypt on these rivers. They relied so much on these rivers to live. And then here they're hearing that they're going to be dried up and empty. And all their efforts are for nothing. So moving on in verses 11 through 15. So in verse 11 it says, surely the princes of Zoan are fools. The counsel of the wise counselors of Pharaoh is become brutish. How say ye unto Pharaoh, I am the son of the wise, the son of the ancient king. So I've got a map here, in which I'll get my laser pointer out. I've got a map here, and we notice that Zoan is mentioned, the princes of Zoan. Well, here's a map of the delta, and I guess I should have made it a little bigger. But as you can see here in this delta, you've got all these rivers coming out of the Great Sea, the Mediterranean Sea. They're all coming down through here. This is the Nile River. So Egypt is relying on these rivers, and Zoan is located right here. This is Zoan, so this is what we're talking about. It says, the princes of Zoan are fools, the counsel of the wise counselors of Pharaoh has become brutish. So I would like to stop here for a minute and just kind of ask if anyone, and I doubt you do, but does anyone remember Zoan being mentioned at any other places in the Bible? And Penny hates these types of questions because you would have to specifically look for this at some point in time. But if we go back to the book of Numbers, we do have mention of Zoan. And we have a pretty specific statement being made, which I thought was interesting. In the book of Numbers in chapter 13, in verse verse 22. So I thought this was interesting because it gave like a time stamp here. It says, "And they ascended by the south and came unto Hebron, where Ammon, Shishai, Talmai, and the children of Anak were." And it says, "Now Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan." So I thought that was interesting just because Zoan was mentioned, and then suddenly now it's saying that it was built 7 years before Hebron. And then another instance is in Genesis chapter 46. And I know this may be overkill, but I do find it interesting to see when places are mentioned. In Genesis chapter 46, we had Jacob lived in the region of Goshen, in which I think I've got my laser pointer right on Goshen right now on the map. So he lived in that region, and this is when they went into Egypt. So Genesis 46, starting in verse 28 through the rest of the chapter. Would anyone want to read that? Yeah, if you wanted to read Genesis chapter 46, verses 28 through 34.
And he sent Judah before him unto Joseph to direct his face unto Goshen, and they came into the land of Goshen. And Joseph made ready his chariot, and went up to meet Israel his father to Goshen, and presented himself unto him. And he fell on his neck, and wept on his neck a good while. And Israel said unto Joseph, Now let me die, since I have seen thy face, because thou art yet alive. And Joseph said unto his brethren and unto his father's house, I will go up and show Pharaoh, and say unto him, My brethren and my father's house, which were in the land of Canaan, come unto me. And the men are shepherds, for their trade hath been to feed cattle, and they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. And it shall come to pass, when Pharaoh shall call you, and shall say, What is your occupation? That ye shall say, The servant's trade has been about cattle from our youth even unto now, both we and also our fathers, that we may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination unto the Egyptians.
Okay, so like I said, I like looking back at past events that are in this area that we're now talking about. So we do have some significant recorded events that took place in this area. So again, as you look at the map and the whole layout of this land, most of this is sand and rocks. The people are dependent upon these rivers, especially this Nile River, which goes all the way down here. And down below this map is actually Ethiopia. So they were very dependent on the Nile River. And now they're getting threatened for all of that drying up. And it says in verse 12, it says, well, let's look at verse 11 once again. So surely the princes of Zoan are fools. The counsel of the wise counselors of Pharaoh have become brutish. So how say ye unto Pharaoh, I am the son of the wise and the son of the ancient king? So if you remember correctly, Egypt prided themselves as being very wise. They had all these wise men. They thought that they were the smartest ones out there. And now it's saying that they've become fools. They've become brutish. And in verse 12, it says, Where are they? Where are thy wise men? And let them tell thee now, and let them know what the Lord of hosts hath purposed upon Egypt. If they're so wise, then ask them what's going to happen. Verse 13, the princes of Zoan are become fools. The princes of Noph are deceived, and they that have seduced Egypt, even they that are the stay of the tribes thereof. And the Lord hath mingled a perverse spirit in the midst thereof, and they have caused Egypt to err in every work thereof. As a drunken man staggereth in his vomit, neither shall there be any work for Egypt, which the head or tail, branch or rush may do. Let's see here. So, as a quick side note, so the princes of Noth. So when you look up Noth, that's actually the capital of Memphis, which is right here on the map. So that would give you an idea as to where Noth is located at. So one of the things that's interesting here is, and we can make some New Testament connections now. So one of the things that's interesting is in verse 13 where it says the princes of Noth are deceived. They have also seduced Egypt, even they that are to stay of the tribes thereof. The Lord hath mingled a perverse spirit in the midst thereof, and they have caused Egypt to err in every work thereof, as a drunken man staggereth in every work. So when we started off studying the book of Isaiah, okay, it's 10:43. We started off studying the book of Isaiah. One of the major things that the people were guilty of is they had forgotten God. They had forgotten the statutes that God had put in place that He wanted them to follow. So they had become ignorant, let's say, and basically led astray in their own delusions. So we do have some New Testament references here about people straying away in their own delusions. And let's see here. And before I say anything, does anyone have any idea of where I may be going with this? Because I know I'm bad about just going and not slowing down. Would anyone want to read Romans chapter 1, starting in verse 18? Man, and really it goes through the rest of that chapter. Does anyone want to read Romans chapter 1, 18 through 32? And again, we're talking about people refusing to have God in their knowledge, people who are basically deceiving themselves into the lifestyles that they're now in, basically leading themselves astray in their own delusions. So, would anyone want to read that? Okay.
The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, to hold the truth and unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them. God has showed it unto them. The invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that, when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and the birds, and the four-footed beasts, and creeping things. Wherefore, God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worship and serve the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. This cause God gave them up unto vile affections, for even their women did change their natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise, also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving unto themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, and debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them.
So this is a group of people who just are ignorant. They had no interest in learning what God expects out of them. They continued in the sinful lifestyle. And Paul is basically saying, you know, you're choosing to go down this road. God's not just going to intervene and force you to stop doing this stuff. If you're choosing to do it, you're going to continue to do it, and you're going to be found sinful. This is why if we lose that knowledge of God and we lose our knowledge of what His Word tells us, we're in such danger to go down the road of these folks that are in Romans chapter 1. We're in danger of doing these things because we're becoming ignorant. And then we start deceiving ourselves and justifying our actions on our own wisdom and other men's wisdom. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 10, let's see here, second Thess. Well, I'm terrible for that. I always turn to first. It's either, if it's 2 Peter, I'll turn to 1 Peter. If it's 2 Timothy, I'll turn to 1 Timothy. So let me get there. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, and starting in verse 10, therefore I endure all things for the elect's sake, that they may also obtain the salvation which is in Christ Jesus with eternal glory. It is a faithful saying, for if we be dead with Him, we shall also live with Him. If we suffer, we shall also reign with Him. If we deny Him, we will also deny ourselves. So it's going along the same thought process of denying that knowledge that we can receive out of God's Word and from God. And basically people today who refuse to obey the gospel, I mean, they're falling into that same category of people from years past. They're falling into the category of refusing the knowledge of God. The knowledge of God says we need to obey the gospel of Christ. People who do not obey the gospel of Christ are not only refusing Christ, but they're refusing the knowledge of God, which tells us that's how we can have our sins washed away. Let's see. 10:51, I would say we probably call it quits. Did anyone have any additional things or comments to make? Or maybe you can bring some more clarity to whatever I've maybe rambled on about. Anything?
Just that I was just reading in Romans chapter 1, leads right into my lesson.
Does it?
I might as well just bring my computer up there and let you finish out.
No, No, I just did an introduction.
I have a question.
Yes.
How many years was it from the time they left Egypt until the time of Egypt's destruction or judgment? This time.
How many years? Wow, Shannon, that'll have to be a point that I bring to you next week. I'd have to study it. You got something?
Said that
701-ish BC. So we would have to see what the date was when they left. Believe it or not, I have a book. It's this map book that Penny got me. And it's got all that information in it. And I'll bring that next time and we can look at that. But it shows a timeline of when they came out of Egypt all the way up to like this point and then maybe points after this. But I don't know it off the top of my head, but